Welcome, everyone, a webinar on improving sales with science. My name is Brian Frabel. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Veelo, and I am super excited to have Chanin Ballance, CEO and founder of Veelo, and Tim Riesterer, Chief Strategy and Research Officer at Corporate Visions. Just quick housekeeping. At any point in time, feel free to use the GoToWebinar panel to ask a question. I'll be interjecting a couple as we go along, and then we'll also leave time at the end for a more detailed Q&A. And with that, Chanin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'll over to the slide here. All right, so I get to talk about one of my favorite topics today, leveraging brain science for sales training to ultimately help our sellers sell more. There's so much that's going on in the field right now. We're still really in this nascent stage, but in the last decade alone, there's been a fair amount of research on how the brain processes information and how the chemistry works in the brain that impacts the way we learn, we retain information, and how our interactions with buyers make a difference. So with this webinar, we're going to talk about a few different elements that you'll be able to apply to your training programs for immediate benefit. Before we jump into the science, though, I want to level set a little bit about what we see today. At Veelo, we get to talk to hundreds of companies a year, and we have the privilege of listening to what they've been doing for sales onboarding, training, skill reinforcement, what their aspirations are, what they'd like to do, and of course some of their constraints, whether it's the know-how, the resources, the subject matter experts. And there's a couple things we see. One, sales trainers know often what they want to add and what they want to do, but when they're using outside sales training resources, it's usually from one of these 20 kind of top training companies. And when you look at the sales methodology, it's largely the same over the last decade. It's a classroom-based format, lecture style, and it's mostly around solution selling type skills, differences from one program to the next. But it hasn't necessarily kept pace with changes in how people buy today. So it's interesting that this is still the primary support vehicle. The other thing we see a lot of, and this is probably even more prevalent than the outside sales training, is that there's a lot of product training. And most of the sales enablement organizations realize they need a lot more than this and are working really hard to incorporate it. But product marketing kind of got a head start, right? They're usually hired before enablement functions. There's lots of content to draw from. Sellers, of course, need to learn how to make products. And so for kind of almost a default mechanism, a lot of the training for salespeople is still around product today. And this would all be fine because 10 years ago, some solution selling skills combined with some product training was probably pretty useful. But when we look at how buyers buy today, there's a gap. And I don't need to tell you that the buying process has changed. You've probably heard this in countless webinars already, and every research firm has statistics that support this in one way or another, whether it's plus or minus X%. But you don't even need a research firm to tell you the buying process has changed. You know from your own personal experience. I would like to point out, however, my favorite stat on this is the Corporate Visions one, and I'm not just saying that, but if you have a buying process and you show up and you have someone who helps you with that helpful insight, it certainly is very effective and important in the process. And I had this experience last weekend myself. Believe it or not, buying something as simple as a sleeper mattress. If you know me, you would know that I'm not usually one to buy things like sleeper mattresses, but we need one. We have many visitors coming this summer. And so I spent 2 hours of my life online doing the research ahead of time, finding out all the sleeper mattresses, deducing it down to 2 likely ones. And I thought, okay, I know the product, the feature benefits. I looked at all the reviewers. I'm ready to now try and make a decision. But I couldn't make the decision without, of course, buy-in from my family because it's their guests who are going to be sleeping on the mattress, and I don't want to hear about it midsummer how horrible it is. So we all, much to their chagrin, my 10-year-old and 13-year-old son and my husband, we went to Crate and Barrel this weekend to go look at sleeper mattresses. So I show up with my information in hand, and the 2 that I likely picked for us weren't, in fact, the best 2. But I needed the help of the salesperson to understand what we were trying to accomplish and show us what these were about to buy. And this is, of course, a B2C sale and something as uninteresting as a sleeper mattress, but consider it a $100,000 product sale, and the process is nearly the same. And it's when I need that seller to help me understand, with maybe some helpful insight or unrecognized need, that this is the best product for me. And so when we look at this process and we look at sales training, how do we help sellers better encounter or support the buying process at this stage versus the early awareness stage of product feature benefits? And to further support this, we know from a survey that HubSpot did last year, and it kind of tells us what we would have thought, right? That out of 500 buyers surveyed, that 60% of them preferred to encounter the salesperson at the consideration stage. Much like me and my sleeper mattress, they wanted to look ahead and find out at least kind of the basics of what was out there and have some level of perceived confidence that they deduced at least from the majority, from the prevalence of options down to ones that were most likely a good fit for them. Now, they're probably going to show up to the store just as misguided or confused as I was, because the ones that I deduced weren't quite the right ones. But nevertheless, most buyers today are feeling like they need to be able to do some of this in advance of meeting the salesperson. And so again, as a sales trainer and enablement function, what does your training program need to look like? And how do you leverage science to make this effective? So when we talk to buyers and we ask them, we say, okay, well, what do you want from your sales organization or from your sales reps who you encounter at that consideration stage? And we hear things like this. We want you to listen to my needs and ask me good questions. All right, that makes sense. We want you to share customer stories, and we want you to give us advice on how you solved these problems before. We want you to help me create some business justification and how to buy. I have other people that need to be involved in this decision, much like my sleeper mattress, a different set of buyers, of course, but still a similar motivation. And I want you to show me that you care about my success. So for those of you involved in influencing your training programs, you may be looking at this list going, ugh, boy, there's a lot we need to do here. But it may not be as daunting as you think, because a lot of this information exists in your organization. In fact, you can think about the people in your sales force. Who's the best storyteller on your sales force? They're probably also one of your top performers. Start to extract those stories, bring them together. And I'm going to come back to why storytelling in particular is so powerful and the science behind it. But when you're looking to design the content and the training, organizations need to be bringing in more of these elements than relying purely on outside sales training sources and or product training. And the science says take advantage of dopamine when you're designing your training and introducing it to your sales force. In fact, dopamine is probably the most efficient way to help your sellers adopt new skills and change behavior. It's that chemical pathway in your brain that you feel kind of a surge when you get excited or really engaged with something, when you're highly motivated, when you're anticipating reward. That's dopamine kicking in. And it's like the magical save button for memory. And so as a trainer, what you need to do is take advantage of the natural spikes of dopamine in the sales process. And unlike other roles, there's so many opportunities in the selling process for dopamine spikes that you can take advantage of. Think about even something as simple as inside sales. You're making call after call, and you're expecting to get voicemail, but as soon as you hear that click of a button, you get that surge of dopamine, and that's when sellers need to have that information ready to apply in that conversation, and that circuit right there is great for retention. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how you can use some modern technology to actually take advantage of this natural workflow of sellers and those dopamine spikes. But really quick before we jump into that, just a little bit more science on how memory works. For you to store information in your brain to remember it later to apply in a good selling conversation, you first have to get the attention, right? So get the attention of your sellers. Make it interesting, short, useful. They need to know there's something in it for them to even pay attention to this in the first place. And only when that attention happens does that encoding in the brain kick in. In fact, if the dopamine hasn't started at this point, the encoding doesn't happen very well. The information will come in and it'll leak out just as fast. So when you have traditional classroom lecture style training, one of the reasons you see all these stats about how so much information of learning is lost within 30 days is because the dopamine levels are really low in a classroom setting. And not all, some are engaging and interesting, of course, but a lot of them are not. And so as a person is up there lecturing for an hour on some particular technique, sellers are checking their phones, yawning, not fully engaged, and if you don't have their attention and that dopamine level isn't kicking in, then that encoding process isn't happening. And if that encoding process doesn't happen, then they're not going to store that information in their brain, or it'll never really get there very well. But you can't stop there, because even when you manage to store that information, it starts to atrophy over time, in the sense that you have to be able to retrieve it later, and that retrieval process, applying it in a good selling conversation, is what strengthens the memory. It's kind of this lovely feedback loop. Think of it as a muscle fiber that if you don't use, it weakens, but as you use it, it gets stronger, and it's more agile to pull out that quick bit of information in a selling conversation. So when you look to design your training and leverage science, you have to keep this memory building process in mind, and you need to find opportunities to take advantage of the natural spikes in dopamine during the selling process. And like I said, there are many. I mean, that's why a lot of salespeople get into selling, is because of the dopamine kicks. It's anytime you're about to give a presentation. It's anytime you're about to pick up the phone and talk to a customer. It's when you know you're helping them solve a problem. It's when you're going to be recognized and rewarded by your organization because you exceeded expectations. These are great opportunities where dopamine levels run high. And so here are a few examples that we see where customers are taking advantage of the dopamine levels, where, 10 years ago it just wasn't possible. Maybe you were forced to do just that classroom training because you didn't have this technology to be in the sales workflow. Or perhaps maybe your next evolution was web-based training, which we still see a lot of today. But think about web-based training. It's usually in a learning management system, somewhere that the seller has to navigate to. And once they get there, they have to click through compliance training and a whole bunch of other stuff to find it. And then when they do find that web-based training class, it's like 20 or 30 minutes long. What's going on with dopamine right now? You've all had to take web-based training. You know you can't click through it fast enough. Dopamine levels are super low. You're bored out of your mind. So that encoding isn't happening. But when you're using technology, modern technology in the sales process, you can start to do things like this. And here's an example of a simple battle card. We see a lot of battle cards that are embedded in sales playbooks or maybe on a sheet, a piece of paper. But they're difficult to find when sellers actually need them right before that call to get that quick little messaging bit, that sound bite. So what do we see about this artifact here? Well, it's on a phone. Okay, so that implies it's easy to find and access. It doesn't have to be on a phone, mind you. Perhaps it's an inside seller and they just need to pull it up on their desktop. Same concept, but it's easy to access. And so they can get it when that dopamine level is highest. Secondly, it implies interactive. If you notice here, there's even an audio clip, right? The fact that I have to interact with it is keeping that attention level stronger, and so that encoding is going to happen. I'm going to remember and put this in my memory. It's a great bit of information to be able to use, to interact with, to get on the spot when I'm selling. And it's a small bit of information that I typically need to reference frequently during the sales process. And here's another example of one of the technologies I quite like on the market today that we didn't have a few years ago. And it's the video coaching technology. So we use this for customers typically in the onboarding process, but think about what's happening here with dopamine. I'm going to have to record a quick pitch, and my manager and my colleagues are going to get to view it. That alone naturally spikes dopamine, right? I'm anticipating that reward and recognition, or failure, but hopefully that reward and recognition that I got it right. And it can be a great way of really helping the seller embed that information. Plus they're also practicing and kind of working out the kinks and however they're messaging or talking about this, which is super helpful. But you have to pair it with that recognition, because it's that recognition reward path that's spiking the dopamine. In fact, we see some organizations where the sales coaching is now reviewed by somebody in the back that the sellers have no association to, and the dopamine levels are going to start to drop there because that reward and recognition isn't the same as their own sales management team being involved. Lastly, one of my other technologies that I really love is in-context support. Why is this important? Because sometimes those dopamine spikes, as a trainer or as a manager, as a leader, you're never going to be around the salesperson when they need that information. You've got to empower them to get it quickly themselves. And this is an example of content and coaching in the CRM. And why this is so effective is because you never really know sometimes when you're going to contact or connect with your prospect. You know, you'll set meetings and you'll be able to prepare in advance for some, but other times you're trying to connect with them by email to get information, to help educate, to kind of nudge and influence the sale along. And having that information available by product, by opportunity, or even just quickly able to search and find is a great way to help reinforce training information and, you know, helping them adopt that skill and change that behavior. So these are 3 different ways you can use technology to take advantage of that natural spike in dopamine throughout the sales process so that you have a better impact on with your training. And I would argue that this alone, if you can find a way to incorporate some of this into your sales enablement program, will give you one of the best returns out of all your possible training practices because of the natural chemistry going on. Oops, sorry about that. So on the science side, one more little bit of added here. Based on the research, this pretend and perform aspect of training, when a seller has to do that, that induces that dopamine. It's like a 20 to 30% retention based on most of the research. So that's where that, you know, real training ROI happens if you can get that engagement and figure out a way to take advantage of that dopamine spike. Okay, so I want to go back to what the sellers say that they want from, or what the buyers say that they want from the sellers, because this, again, this is really important to figure out how to incorporate into your training programs to better arm your sellers with the types of skills they need to have these successful conversations today. And what we talked about on the previous slide was, you know, I want you to listen to my needs. I want you to ask me good questions. I want you to share customers' stories and advice. I want you to help me create business justification and value. And I want you to demonstrate you care about my success. I know you get commissions, but I need you to care and show that you're doing this in a good way. These can be difficult things to train on, but science tells us it's really important to include an element of trust. And you're going to see, I predict, a lot more research about this in the coming years. There's quite a bit on the market out there today. How do you incorporate trust into your sales program in a genuine way? And to be fair, there are some sales methodologies that include trust tactics, but the difference is it has to be genuine. In fact, we're pretty good as buyers of knowing when, or at least sensing when it's not genuine, when we don't necessarily trust or expect the salesperson to be representing our interests legitimately. And the science tells us that decision-making is emotional. Most of you have probably seen some of the great research that Corporate Visions has produced. We like to think our decision-making is very logical and, you know, based on feature requirements and you know, skilled assessments of our RFPs. But all the science tells us it's not. It's very emotional, and in a large part it's due to this chemical oxytocin, yeah, I'm saying it wrong. My husband unfortunately made a joke today about oxycodone, and it's stuck in my head. But this chemical is the one that floods your brain. It's also the one that you start to feel when you fall in love, right? It's that trust, social building neurotransmitter that helps you feel safe in making this decision. And in fact, if you don't have a high level of this coming into your brain when you're talking with sales, it can actually work in a negative way. In fact, your company may have the best product, the best legitimate solution for that prospect, but if they don't have a high sense of trust with the salesperson, they're not going to believe it. It's going to go the other way. It's going to impact them to go with maybe the product with the organization that has some nice value as well, but a salesperson they trust is actually helping them make the best decision.
Shannon,
Yeah.
a question for you. This is really interesting, and I think we've all experienced that stereotypical used car salesman, and immediately trust level goes down. Is this something you'd recommend that organizations put into their sales training in terms of how you message to feel like you're trustworthy?
Yes, to some degree, and I'll talk about that just in a second. You're absolutely right. I mean, I always kind of cringe at the used sales car analogy, but you know, it is true that most people have a predisposition to an immediate distrust of sales until proven otherwise. And so how you overcome this definitely needs to be taken into consideration by an organization. And building trust takes time. It's certainly part of the sales interaction, but it's also, you know, the brand promise and following through with that and some of the other elements that touch the buyer throughout the process. But from a training aspect, how you can leverage the science and actually bring it into your program could look like this. So I'm going back to the stories. Most of the research shows that stories is one of the fastest ways to build trust, because when we hear stories, we see ourselves as the protagonist in that narrative, and we start to see ourselves being successful in making that same decision. And so as we're hearing the success story from the salesperson, we start to feel more trusting of the salesperson, and the solution is good for us. So by capturing those great stories within your organization and helping your sales team get really good at sharing them at the right time with the buyers is a great way to help build that trust element. And this is different. We tell our customers this is different than giving your salespeople a bunch of case studies. Your case studies are great, but they're usually in a typical format. They have a problem, they have a solution, they have marketing jargon, and they have unmemorable statistics. That's not what your sellers need. They need the storyline. They need the story that has the beginning, the middle, the twist, and then the success, right? Because sellers, they have to see themselves, or the buyers have to see themselves as that protagonist. So build that in. That's one of the fastest ways. The other is a little less tangible, but we talk about a strong sales culture. And don't get me wrong, we all know salespeople need to win deals, and you know, we're all working hard to help them achieve better quota attainment. But there are little things you can do to build that success culture within your sales organization, and that's just sharing the stories of where the organization has genuinely helped the customers, and acknowledging where the salesperson helped in that process, empowering them that that process would be incomplete without them, so they can take pride in that organizational success as well. Just little changes to behavior like that start to instill that culture where your sellers can develop those genuine trusting aspects with their prospects. And lastly, educate them, share the research. This is really important, and if you're interested in some of the papers following this webinar, we're happy to share them. But it's really interesting how buyers make decisions based on this trust, and how lack of it demonstrated in the sales process can really torpedo or negatively impact that sale. So that was probably a long answer, Brian. Did I kind of at least address on what you were hoping for?
Yeah, I think you answered it perfectly. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so I'm going to leave you with that. Hopefully there's a couple good things that you can apply today. Certainly looking at your current training and matching it to what you know buyers want, or at least what we're hearing they want. Looking at where your sellers are encountering them in the sales process, making sure that they have the right skills to address those points. Using science, right, leveraging that, especially the dopamine spikes in your training. That's where you're going to get the biggest impact. And then looking at trust and how you can incorporate better stories, and you know, not only for helping the customer see themselves successful, but improving outcomes in the sales relationship. So with that, I'm going to transfer it to Tim. I hear you've been doing some great new research. I want to hear all about messaging and how this improved process can help salespeople be more successful.
All right. Well, thanks, Shannon. I appreciate that. It's always good to join you. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this today. The science that you bring to it as a technology partner for companies, recognizing technology is not the answer. There's science involved in how it's applied, just adds a ton of value to the way people can think about organizing their content and serving it up in a way that I love it. Dopamine, it's like a performance-enhancing drug that salespeople can use that won't get them banned from the league. So That's good.
Yeah, for the most part, right, yes.
Right, exactly. And oxytocin. I mean, you were whipping them all out there.
Thank you.
And so today I want to talk a little bit about, so one of the things is serving up the right content at the right time and when those dopamine spikes hit. But the messaging itself, the actual construct of the content, the messaging elements that you create as a company and how those work is, in my mind, equally as important to talk about here today, because there's ways to serve up content, there's moments to serve up content, but if the content sucks, then nothing, it sort of falls apart at that point. So I want to kind of focus on that. Anybody who is familiar with our research knows that we take sort of a unique approach to the way you create messaging. And the idea is that it's not about asking sellers what they do to be successful and then finding out which sellers seem to be most successful and making other sellers copy them. It's really about understanding the invisible forces that shape and influence a buyer's decision. And Chanin started to talk about that in terms of some of the chemicals as well as the trust thing. We dig into the neuroscience, social psychology, and behavioral economics behind how buyers shape and frame value and how they ultimately make choices, and then run simulations of different messages to see which ones they react the most favorably to, which ones drive most purchase intent, which ones create most favorable attitudes, etc. And then bring that to you guys to help you shape your content in a way that's a framework that's been more tested and proven against the science versus what we think or feel or the opinions we have about what good messaging is. And so today I want to talk about two pieces of research we've done, and as a result show you two frameworks and how they work differently, if you will, how you have to think differently at different moments in the customer's life cycle. We're first going to talk about when you're trying to acquire a customer or convince a customer to do something different. That we call that the why change conversation. Can we identify and test a framework that works best for messaging and content that helps convince a customer to make a change, to do something different? And once now they are a customer and they're doing something with you, is there a difference in the customer renewal conversation? And just for giggles, I call it the why stay conversation. So when you are not the choice, or what you're trying to sell is not the current choice, and you're trying to acquire that customer and convince them to change, what do you do? And when you are that status quo, when you are the incumbent, do you do the same thing, or should you do something different to convince them to stay? And that's what I want to talk about today, and those are the two pieces of research. Now, fundamentally, I got to give you one premise from my perspective on the science of decision making. If you learn one thing in your career as a marketing or selling person, you need to understand status quo bias. And that is because all human beings live in status quo bias, and when you are trying to market or sell to someone, your main job is to try and work within this constraint called status quo bias. If you're trying to change someone's mind, you need to know why it's so hard to change it, and then as a result directly address those reasons they stick with the status quo. And there are 4 causes or reasons people stick with the status quo. Now, you may know you need to address and defeat the status quo, but if you don't know what causes it, you can create messages till the cows come home. And I live in Wisconsin, so that's how I roll with a cow analogy. You can create that much messaging and never attack, never address, never disrupt the status quo. So I'm going to teach you real quickly the 4 causes of status quo bias. The first, preference stability. This is this idea that human beings tend to do everything possible to keep their current preferences stable. That means when they hear about something new and improved, they're curious for a moment, but their natural reaction is to try and figure out how much that's like what they're already doing. The word like is your enemy in marketing and sales. If someone says, oh, that's just like, or that's kind of like, that doesn't mean they like you. That, in fact, means the opposite. It means they're trying to restabilize their preferences and convince themselves they don't need to do anything different. Preference stability is the enemy, and you need to know how to defeat it. The second cause of status quo bias is the cost of change, the perceived cost of change. People believe the current situation and status quo is already free, bought and paid for, already part of the operating budget, already suffered the struggles of implementation and onboarding, already paid the startup costs, all the things that it takes to make a decision. I already put myself out on the line to get budget. I already caused a bunch of people to try and come to consensus for a decision. Why would I want to do that again? All the perceived cost, both financial and personal, is identified with the change. So what you're up against when you have some new thing is them immediately projecting all the cost, personal and financial, associated with the change. How do you defeat that? Third, selection difficulty. People are overwhelmed with information, no news flash there, but as a result, they can't tell the difference. How do you help them tell the difference clearly enough for them to see the value in making a change? And then finally, anticipated regret and blame. This is my favorite because human beings are so special. We can project into the future and anticipate the blame and regret we're going to have when we make a new decision or make a change, and everyone looks and says, that didn't work out so great. And you start to think, you know what, the status quo is bad, it's not perfect, but I'm not dead yet. That change, that could kill me. So this is what you're up against. And my question to you is, when you build your messages to go out there and defeat the status quo, acquire new logos in business, or convince people to change, are you aware of and specifically looking to defeat that conversation or defeat these four causes? So let's talk about that for a second. Defeating status quo bias requires a framework that deliberately destabilizes people's current preferences. The power of persuasion is based fundamentally on the issue of uncertainty. If I am currently certain, I am not persuadable. It is not until I'm uncertain about my status quo, where my preferences are destabilized in some way, that I'm actually open to being persuaded to do something different. Because at all costs, I want to keep my current preferences stable. So you must destabilize their preferences. Second, you must show them there's actually a cost of staying the same. So first, your message must destabilize their current preferences. Let them know that there's something unexpected and something unconsidered that they hadn't really thought about, and it's affecting their current situation. And then you need to show them that there's a cost or a loss associated with staying in their current position, because you can't have just the cost burden on the change, because you can't create an ROI big enough to convince them to leave something as safe and secure as status quo. You actually have to show them that their status quo is not as safe and secure, and there's a cost of staying there. And you must clearly create contrast. The emotional part of the brain that makes the decision to change actually does not contain the capacity for language. That resides in the rational part of the brain that justifies a change but doesn't make the change. The rational part of the brain that justifies the change, that has a capacity for language, is how people explain the logical reasons for making a decision and how they lie to themselves and everyone else about how rational that decision was. Inside of the real decision-making part of the brain, it requires contrast. It needs to see enough difference between what they're doing today and what you're recommending tomorrow to see the value in making that risky change. If there's not enough contrast between what they're doing today and what you're suggesting tomorrow, why would they take the risk of change? You must clearly show contrast. And then anticipated regret and blame. It's called the before and after hero story. At some point, 90% of the market wants to know that somebody else has done this before them and done it successfully. 10% of the market is going to have this figured out regardless of how crappy your message is. And the other 90%, though, need to hear a good story, and that's something Chanin was talking about earlier. They need to be able to put themselves into the story and see themselves currently in the before situation and have a vision of them succeeding in the after. In fact, we believe in this model so much that we've identified a model and a framework that you can build called the Why Change Story framework, or Why Change Story model. It opens with introducing an unconsidered need. It then pivots in order to create a sense of urgency by showing them the cost of staying the same, the flaws, limitations in their current approach. Not because their current approach is stupid, but because you just made them smarter about challenges, problems, missed opportunities they didn't even know they had. And now as a result, they need a different way to address that. And by contrast, by clear contrast, you have an improved new safe, an improved new path or new way. And then finally, you can tell a story of someone just like them who succeeded. This is a particular order that we have tested and proven. In fact, we've run tests every time on the work we've done. I love the way your template flooded my color, Shannon. This is making me look very sensitive to have all this.
Sorry about that.
And I'm sure Dr. Zach appreciates that too. So we work with Zach Tormel at Stanford to run studies, create simulations, impanel would-be decision makers, create different test conditions and models, and find the winning formula. And that framework I just showed you won a recent work we did with Zach, where we introduced 4 frameworks to people making a decision to do something different to see which one would win. One, the standard solution framework, the first one on the left, was a presentation that simply identified the customer's confirmed identified needs and then introduced a solution and then credentialed the company. The value-added approach was one that did similar. It identified and confirmed the customer's needs. It then introduced a solution and then identified some value-added capabilities as differentiators. The third one they viewed introduced and confirmed the known needs first and solved the problem, but then introduced an unexpected, unconsidered need. And then the fourth testing condition opened in the framework we showed you, an unconsidered need that then showed and exposed a flaw in the current approach and then introduced a new path. And it turns out, in an effort to be unique and different, to create uncertainty in the customer's mind so they're open to persuasion, you must introduce an unconsidered need. If you are only referring to known needs by the customer, either needs you identified in voice of the customer research or diagnostic discovery, if you're only responding to the identified stated needs of the customer, you don't get the benefit of uniqueness or differentiation or uncertainty in your presentation. In fact, you lose. You lose by a factor of 50%. So step one to make sure is it incorporate an unconsidered need. Then we ask the question of the quality of the presentation, the quality of the presenter, the quality of the institution, at least as perceived by the listener. And again, there was one clear winner, a statistically significant difference in favor of the framework we showed you earlier. The person who introduces the unconsidered need immediately before getting to the needs they already know and are certain about, the one who introduces the uncertainty not only creates uniqueness and differentiation, but also is identified as the highest quality, the most trusted. So interestingly, you can get a mantle of quality and trust by telling the customer something they didn't know. Why? Because if you repeat back to them what they told you, the needs they told you, that makes you a tape recorder. To be a trusted advisor is when you maybe tell them something they didn't already know, and it seems to bear that out in the test. Trust and quality, perception of a higher quality institution, product, and provider goes up when you tell them something they didn't know, but only when you do it first. And then finally, intentions to decide, attitudes and choice, willingness to pay more. In other words, the persuasive power of a message is improved by greater than 10% if you tell them something they didn't know about a problem or opportunity they didn't know they had first before starting. So again, the framework that we tested and proven says there's science called status quo bias, and that science must be deliberately defeated. And by identifying the 4 causes, you can identify a framework with 4 messaging components in it, and you can deliberately create and deliver a message in that all-important customer acquisition mode in the customer conversation. So now, without belaboring that too much, let's move on to the idea of customer renewal. One of my favorite questions when we did that in the original research was, hey, it's great to know how to disrupt the status quo, but in 70% of my revenue, I am the status quo. It means I've got existing customers. So should you have the same conversation with people when you are the status quo as when you're trying to disrupt the status quo? In other words, should you be as challenging and provocative with your existing customers who you're trying to renew, and we've also tested this in communicating price increases, as you are when you're trying to convince them to change? So what we did is we put together pitches that we compared to each other, created a whole new simulation, impaneled a whole another group of more than 500 people, and put them in a condition where one group heard a pitch that was designed at the moment of customer renewal to tell them something they didn't know, give them a new need, expose them to an insight about an unconsidered need and a new way of solving it. And then we thought maybe, just maybe, that it's possible that if you are the status quo, you should be instead reinforcing the status quo, not disrupting the status quo. And so we deliberately created a contrasting story that reinforced the status quo. In fact, because you are the current preference, reinforce that preference. We also heavily reinforced that the cost of change would be a potential burden compared to the fact that they've made an investment with you. We reinforced the fact, ironically, that there aren't many differences between the vendors, so why take the risk of change? And we reinforced the possibility that you've made great progress over the last couple years in our relationship. Do you want to put that at risk and slow down the progress or potentially take a step backwards? What I don't have time to do today is to walk you through the exact details of the winning framework, but here's the framework. So if you're interested afterward, we can send you a link to a more elaborate discussion of the actual scripting and the actual content so you can see how this works. But it turns out that the winning Why Stay formula is one that actually reinforces status quo, does not provoke, does not challenge, does not drive a new insight into a customer that's about to renew, because it tends to disrupt the dialogue. Let's look at the results here real quick from the Why Stay story, and I'll come back to that framework. We were able to show, and we weren't even intending to show this. In fact, we ran the test twice with two different groups of people. Almost 1,000 people went through this test just to see if what we were hearing is right. We tested 1,000 people, put them into 3 different groups. The group that heard the story that reinforced the status quo bias had a statistically significant higher positive feeling about their current vendor. Those who reviewed a story that had a provocative message with new unconsidered needs and introduced a potential insight to do something different in the next 2 years after the renewal had a less favorable rating. We decided to also include a price increase version, and it turned out that people really didn't like that. But the bottom line is you can get a 10% lift in positive attitudes, which is really important at the moment of renewal, by deliberately reinforcing those 4 causes of status quo bias instead of trying to, at that moment, introduce a new need, a new consideration, a provocative insight. In fact, it seems to have a negative effect. Look at what happened when we measured a bunch of questions related to intentions to renew. In the intention to renew, we ask a number of questions, likelihood of staying with this customer, and a bunch of related questions. And it turns out those 350 that heard the reinforce the status quo organized message had a 13.3% increase in the likelihood and intention to renew. And those that heard the more provocative, disruptive, challenging message at the moment of renewal actually had a decline in their likelihood of renewing. You actually have the exact opposite effect. If you challenge a customer at the moment of renewal with a brand new insight and new needs to be solved, it creates apparently a disruption that lowers the intention to renew versus working the status quo bias in your favor. We then asked the question about likelihood of switching, likelihood of investigating competitive offers. And those who heard us a message that reinforced status quo bias purposefully had a lower likelihood of switching. You had a higher likelihood of switching if you introduced some form of a provocative message, a challenging type message. So interestingly enough, what you see here is the winning framework that we identified after testing multiple conditions, that when you are looking to renew a customer, that is now not the time to disrupt them. It turns out if you disrupt them with a new message, a new insight, a new unconsidered need, a provocation, it opens them up to the idea of change, and that's not as good when you are the customer, you are the incumbent, and you're seeking the renewal, because they're figuring if we're going to have to change and we have to consider change, maybe we should just look around then, because if we're got to change anyways. So the reality is it's better to do this. First, anchor them in a positive way by documenting the positive results and momentum you've had over these current 2 years together as you seek the renewal, so that they all can identify with and appreciate and be anchored in a positive frame that this has a momentum and a trajectory going in the right direction. If you don't have positive results and you have negative results, I'm not sure there's a message in the world that could fix that. So I'm just going to be on record as saying I'm not sure I can fix that with a framework. But anyways, find those results, find the positive results, document that first and anchor them positively. Then briefly review the prior decision-making process. We found this interesting. If you take just a brief moment and quickly reminisce with them about the process they went through to decide on you, it helps those people in the room remember, frankly, how difficult it was, what a big lift it was, and maybe reminds them they don't want to go through that again, but they also remember how rigorous and diligent it was and how much they all believed in you. And also, if there are new decision makers now part of the renewal process that weren't there, now it begins to transfer some ownership to them of a process that they didn't have ownership over before, and maybe they could tilt towards new because, hey, they're new. But now all of a sudden there's group ownership. It's like reinforcing earlier consensus. Identify the progress that's been made and what possible risks there might be if big changes are made. Like what progress is put at risk if you slow the momentum or introduce a different way of doing things. Highlight the cost of change. Identify literally the things they've invested in to get up and running and how those costs are sunk, they're done, they're one time, they're buried, not to be budgeted for, not to be worried about ever again. Subconsciously, unless you try to change, and now you're going to have to find the budget and pay for those. And then the key to close on this is to identify those advances you've made from a competitive standpoint, that you demonstrate you've had their back during the last couple of years, you've made progress in your product, but not in order to introduce and solve for new needs, but to continue to reinforce and solve for the original needs, the original goals, the original objectives. Because what you want to do is keep them focused on the needs they had, the objectives they had, and the goals that they set, and that the progress you're making isn't disruptive, it's additive, and it's going to move them forward against those goals. So that's a quick, simple breakdown, but we'll send you guys the slides on this. But it turns out that there are really two different approaches to why change and why stay. They both relate to status quo bias, but in one case, you're all about disrupting status quo bias, and the other, you're about reinforcing status quo bias, that you need to be situationally fluent. You need to understand the situation that you're building messages for and the science of decision-making behind it, and use that to your advantage. So,
Tim, a quick clarifying question then. Should you never then challenge your existing customer?
So they're an existing customer, and it's a great question. So if you're thinking, wow, I need my customer to do some stuff different, here's what our simulation did prove, and here's what we did not test, to be clear. We set the test up in simulation with people who were at the stage of renewal, the moment of renewal. And I think what I can safely say is do not challenge, do not disrupt, do not surprise, do not make the renewal conversation the moment where you tell them about all this new stuff and try to whip all of your insight and challenging and provocative thoughts on them. Do that safely within the confines of the contract. Socialize this during your quarterly reviews, and then hopefully get your customer asking for that to be included in the renewal discussion. And it turns out, it sounds logical, but many of the companies we talk to do just that. They put all their new stuff in the renewal, and they think that's the way they're going to save the renewal by saying, look at all these new possibilities, look at all these new considerations, we're on top of this, we've got your back, let's do this. And it creates an environment that makes the customer think, well, there's a lot of change going on here, now might be a good time to reinvestigate this thing. And what I'm saying is, if you're challenging the customer, going after new budget and new decisions where you need them to change their mind even though they're an existing customer, you can still challenge them. And when you're safely within the contract, you can challenge them. But do not challenge them at the moment of renewal. I don't have time to go into it, but the moment you're trying to communicate a price increase, do not challenge them there either. We've got new studies to show that at those key moments when you're asking for the renewal or asking for the price increase, that is the moment to reinforce their bias towards you, not to create some sort of disruption where they can reconsider everything.
Interesting. Tim, in your framework, do you also have kind of the process, because a lot of the organizations probably aren't capturing enough of that that reinforcement of the status quo, of the benefits that they've achieved over the course of that year or what have you. Do you have any advice for organizations so they can better enable their customer success managers to have those conversations?
Yes. Now that we know, and that's a great question, now that we know that the best way to open, because we tested multiple ways to open this. We rearranged all these bubbles and ran different conditions, and this was the framework that produced the best statistically significant results. Now that we know this, as an organization, it's paramount that you focus on this. So when we're working with companies now, we're identifying the types of objectives that their solutions typically solve for, the types of reasons customers have made that decision, and then as a result, what can we do to find measurement and proof points? And it might be that some of them are quantifiable and some are qualitative, but the goal is to be able to define. And now that everybody knows this is important for their renewal message, it's time to go searching for those. And they are repeatable. Many of your customers buy to solve similar problems. Your solutions do similar things for each of your customers. So there is a way to identify these are the top 3 things we should be monitoring. If it's adoption and participation, if it's, look for things you can quantify. We had one where they quantified the amount of time they saved on claims processing and how this software took this out. And then a new improvement they were going to make was going to further reduce that number. Again, your improvements need to solve for the problems that you're talking about, not new needs at this moment. So where are the qualitative, quantifiable things that your customers are trying to solve when they buy your stuff and your stuff typically solves for, and figure out how to measure that and track that with a client. I don't have a magic formula for that right now because it's always a little bit different, but the key here is that we now know it is the most important thing and it is the hot opening to your renewal story. So get proactive and start identifying for a framework what those could be and start measuring and tracking those for clients. All right, so with that, I'm willing to take any other questions we might have that might have come through.
Yeah, here's another one, Tim. How does your research either support or conflict with what a lot of people probably have seen from someone like CEB?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that we all read was in HBR, Harvard Business Review, provocation selling. Interestingly, that actually came out during the recession, and if you go back and reread the article now, it's about how to provoke a customer in a down economy. So it was really all about how do you get somebody to spend money when they really are trying not to spend money. So it's a question of whether some of that technique still matters because when you're in a different economy, because it was sort of economy specific. But not far after provocation came challenging. And what I would say is that the idea of challenging a customer is rooted in decision science. CEB's research wasn't rooted in decision science. It was rooted in survey data. But it happened to corroborate the science I just showed you that, in fact, if you're trying to create change and drive a customer to do something different than they're already doing, guess what? In a way, yes, you need to challenge them. You need to get them to question their status quo. So by saying unconsidered needs that destabilize preferences, flawed approaches that show the cost of staying the same, it does line up. But it lines up for that moment. There are other moments in the history of your relationship with a customer, renewals, price increases, where actually there's no data to support that. In fact, our data, actual simulation-based data, would say it has the exact opposite effect. So I guess what we're saying is there's science out there, there are frameworks, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You need to be situational in the way you approach customer moments and use the science knowingly and not just whitewash the entire customer lifecycle with one approach to messaging.
Thanks. Chanin, one for you. Some really cool research here from Tim, and I think a lot of organizations, if they were going to go implement it, they put together a 1-hour, 2-hour class, set everybody in a seat, and feed them with a fire hose. If you were implementing Tim's research and methodologies in a sales organization, can you talk a little bit about what you talked about, how you would do it differently than, say, a traditional 1-hour fire hose session?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you have about 10 minutes with a salesperson before they start checking out, and that's on a good day if they have high motivation to actually listen to what you're saying. Human working memory process is only about 20 minutes, but our research shows that sellers usually won't be engaged that long. So how can you chunk up some of this research and this training in a way that sellers can digest or the customer success managers can digest? And then make sure that the reinforcement of it. I mean, I love the documentation of the status quo and the benefits and the success. What we hear from a lot of account managers, customer success managers, is that information is hard to come by, that history, and those messaging sound bites, they're kind of left to their own devices to come up with them. So if that is prepared and part of that training, making it accessible when they're having those conversations about the renewal or keeping those customers is critical, because that's when the dopamine levels are going to be highest. They're going to need that information. They're going to be motivated to take it and then actually, provide that in a really good conversation with the customer.
Great, thanks. Well, we are coming up just on the top of the hour, so I think we'll close there. Tim and Chanin, thank you very much for your insights, and I'd like to thank all the participants as well. We will, of course, follow up with slides and a replay within the next day. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim, so much for joining us, too. This was great.
Thanks, Chanin.